Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Reichelt. It gives me great pleasure to welcome today Professor Robert Emmett Curran, a professor emeritus of history at Georgetown University, where he served as a faculty member for 32 years. Professor Curran is the author of 3 books on Georgetown University's history. The first one on the first 100 years of Georgetown's existence after it was established in 1789. Titled From Academy to University. The second one, titled The Quest for Excellence, covering the period 1889 and 1964. And the third one, The Rise to Prominence, 1964 to 1989. Professor Curran also published an article on the history of basketball at Georgetown University, titled The Rise and Decline of Georgetown University Basketball in the Thompson Era, 1972 to 2017. But basketball is also featured in his books on the history of Georgetown Universities, particularly in the second and third book. Thank you very much, Emmett, for joining us today.
Happy to be here with you.
My very first question is, why were you interested in studying basketball? Were you always interested in basketball, or did you become interested in basketball because it's so important for Georgetown University?
Well, I must say that I was interested in basketball before I came to Georgetown, before I joined the faculty in 1972. That happened to be the very same year that John Thompson came to Georgetown as its basketball coach. And indeed, Thompson, one of the first things he did was to approach some of us on the faculty about becoming basically the scorers and recorders for the basketball games that we'd have on campus at that time. So I spent the first several years at Georgetown working on the scorer's desk at Georgetown's home games. So my involvement with Georgetown basketball started almost immediately.
Awesome. So everybody, I mean, without exaggeration, I think everybody in the US knows Georgetown University. It's a national brand, but more than that, I think internationally also Georgetown is very well known. And basketball is one of the reasons. So how would you say, how did basketball help Georgetown becoming a national or maybe even international brand?
Well, I think basketball had a good deal to do with Georgetown's rise to prominence. I think it was one of the key ingredients to Georgetown be more or less making it to the national and international maps. And it's interesting how that happened. As I explained in the article and in volume 3 of my history, John Thompson's hiring came about as a result of Georgetown's attempt to greatly improve its image, both with the local community, which was a Black majority community. Washington, D.C., by the 1970s was a majority Black city. Georgetown itself had become, particularly since the Civil War, kind of a white enclave within this majority Black city that was fairly isolated from the larger city. It very much was still within its Southern-oriented tradition. And in the early 70s, by the early 70s, Georgetown was trying to break out of that image. It had been finally caught up in the revolution that the 60s represented for racial justice. And it wanted very much to diversify its student body. It had not had any Black students until the WW2 period. In fact, the largest school in the university, the College of Arts and Sciences, had not had a Black student until the early 60s. So just a decade before Thompson came to Georgetown, uh, Georgetown was still not integrated. So when Georgetown had such a terrible season in 1971-72 that the coach resigned and they started a search for a new basketball coach, Charlie Deacon, who was the dean of admissions of that time, the very person who was trying to diversify Georgetown racially and aggressively recruit Black applicants to Georgetown, Charlie approached the Father Robert Henley, who was the president of Georgetown at the time, and said, I think it'd be a wonderful thing if Georgetown could have a Black basketball coach. It would do more for changing our image locally and nationally than anything else I can think of. And so the president thought this was a great idea. He appointed Charlie Deacon to head up the search committee, and they basically went out and recruited John Thompson, who was coaching at the time at a local Catholic high school. So they persuaded Thompson to become a candidate, and the search committee, naturally enough, selected Thompson. So that was how he happened to come to Georgetown. They said, we'll be very happy if you can get us a couple of appearances in the National Invitational Tournament, the NIT, which by that time had become the second tournament to the NCAAs at that point. But they were setting the bar really low for Thompson, if he could do that. But Georgetown had only been even in the NIT once in the last 20 years. So it wasn't asking much, but what Thompson delivered over the next 20 years was something far in excess of what they were hoping he might do. He really put Georgetown on not only on the map as a basketball power, but he really, as I said, was a factor in the Georgetown's rise to prominence nationally and internationally.
Yeah, and the highlight 1984 winning the national championship. And you talked about now the role of basketball for Georgetown to become a more diverse place, and particularly integrating the African American community, the majority population at that time of the city, into university operations. How about gender? When did women's basketball become more prominent and play a bigger role? I mean, they're not playing in Capital One Arena as the men's team. They play on campus in the McDonough Gymnasium, but still a big hall with fits 2,500 people. I've been there myself to matches, so great atmosphere, many students watching and supporting. So what can you tell us about women's basketball?
Well, as Georgetown did not, it's the largest school, the College of Arts and Sciences, which is where the majority of the undergraduates would have been in the 70s. Georgetown did not integrate its college gender-wise until 1968. So a few years after they admitted the first black males to the college, they integrated the college to become co-ed. And it's interesting that initially they wanted to just have a very limited number of women in the college. 25, I think, was the initial quota. Well, almost immediately that went out the window, so that within a few years, the females were almost a majority within the college. And that meant that they had to begin intercollegiate sports for women as well. That was the time that Title IX went through in the early 70s. And so I was on the athletic board at that particular time. And I remember we had to decide how we were going to implement Title IX, which we're calling basically for equality for women and men's sports. So we decided that we had to have an equal number of major men's sports and major women's sports. So I can remember we decided we'd have two each. And for men, it was quite easy. Georgetown had dropped intercollegiate football, so that wasn't a possibility. So it was going to be basketball and track. Georgetown had a very strong history in track and field. But for the women, it wasn't at all clear what should be the major sports for them. And I can remember, again, track became one, first of all, since they performed together, that was easy to implement. But the second sport, we weren't at all sure what would become the second major women's sport. And I remember we decided to allocate our remaining scholarships between two sports for women, volleyball and basketball, and to see which one emerged over the years. Well, at the time, women's volleyball was much better than women's basketball at Georgetown. But over time, that changed, and women's basketball became the second major sport for women. And they had some by the late 80s, they were becoming very competitive in the Big East and had some success that lasted into the early 90s. So, I mean, they had their own brief period of glory, if you might say.
So before we, the book stopped 1989 because we might maybe in the final part of the conversation talk about contemporary issues. What else maybe you would like to add from like the second and third book where you were talking about basketball? Is there anything else we should know about the history of basketball at Georgetown?
The peak for the Thompson era at Georgetown was certainly in the early 80s when they had that the teams led by Patrick Ewing and Sleepy Floyd. And you can argue that Georgetown came very close to winning 3 straight NCAA championships.
Oh.
That in 1982, their first appearance in the NCAA finals, they could have beaten North Carolina. They lost by a point. But only because a North Carolina players, Georgetown came down with a few seconds left to try to win the game. Georgetown, a North Carolina player, was so out of position, James Worthy, that the Georgetown player thought he was a teammate, and he inadvertently passed the ball to him rather than him setting up Sleepy Floyd, who was ready to take what could very well have been the winning shot. So they lost that heartbreaker. The next year, they beat Houston to win their only NCAA championship. The final, in 85, the Ewing's final year, they played Villanova. And the Villanova coach, Massimino, remarked before the game that he said, I mean, Georgetown was supposed to have perhaps the greatest college team that had ever been put together. So Massimina said, well, I think if we could shoot 50%, we might have a chance to beat Georgetown. Well, they ended up shooting 79%. They missed one shot in the second half, and that was a shot that was blocked by Patrick Ewing. It was just surreal, their ability to score on that particular night. So again, Georgetown lost what could have been its third consecutive championship by 2 points. So I think that was certainly a remarkable run that Georgetown has sadly never come close to replicating.
Yeah, when we look at recent years, positive headlines on sport at Georgetown are coming more from other sports like soccer, like lacrosse. I think the last time the men's basketball team participated in the Final Four was in 2006. Ironically, that year I was a visiting assistant professor on main campus. That was my first faculty job. And but this is now again 17 years ago. And now Georgetown mainly makes headlines like in March of this last year when Coach Patrick Ewing, who was already mentioned a couple of times by you as a player, but he also became a coach when he was fired. So what are your thoughts on the decline of Georgetown men's basketball in the last years? And do you have any hope for the future?
Yes, I do have hope for the future. I think they have a very fine coach in Ed Cooley, who is in his first year having replaced Patrick. Patrick, it's there I think a number of reasons but things Patrick just wasn't able to recruit players that would really be capable of competing at the level that they need to compete at. I think Cooley should be more successful in competing in it, and apparently he has already begun to recruit for next year some very promising newcomers. So I am hopeful, but it has been over, as you mentioned, 2006 was the last time Georgetown got to the Final Four. It's been a long, spare stretch in which Georgetown, which in the first 20 years of the Big East, 25 years, you could say, nearly dominated, was certainly one of the top powers in the conference. And it's really sad to see what's happened over the last 5 to 10 years, where they've really sadly become a bottom feeder in the Big East. But I think with Cooley, there's hope of turning that around.
Okay, it's always good to end with something positive and with hope. Thank you very much, Emmett. I have to say I tremendously enjoyed the conversation, but also reading your work because one cannot just learn about basketball at Georgetown, but also about the Georgetown's history in total and the role Georgetown basketball played, particularly for diversifying the community. I think this is a very important contribution. Thank you very, very, very much, and all the best to you.
All the best to you. Thanks for having me.